Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, so I'll start just with an introduction to myself and the work I've done in high performance sport. So my background or my day-to-day job is I'm the head of psychology in the Irish Institute of Sport, which is essentially the training centre for our Olympic athletes where they get sports science and medicine support. As part of that role, it's combined into every 4 years a role in the Olympics itself. So I attended Rio and London as part of sailing's backroom team, and I also worked with some other sports, modern pentathlon, athletics, and badminton. For the Tokyo Olympics and for Paris, I'll be the lead psychologist with the team overall, which involves working with a number of sports, but also coordinating psychology to the sports I don't work with directly. The sport I have been involved with for the longest time is sailing. One of the reasons being that I sail myself growing up, and it's quite a niche sport, so there aren't sailing sports psychologists dropping from the trees. I was fortunate enough to get an opportunity early in my career, and I guess fortunate enough that the Irish Sailing High Performance Director, James O'Callaghan, and head coach Roy Fitzpatrick are very supportive of psychology and have continued to invest in it in my time as a practitioner. The other sports I work with are athletics, canoeing, modern pentathlon, taekwondo, and I worked with rowing. So I seem to have a propensity for the water sports across my career. The classes I sailed in over the years, mirrors for a long time when they were big back in the 90s. I sailed J24s with Barry O'Neill, who's online, I think, when I moved to Dublin. And I did a few seasons in SB20s as well. But working in sport and sailing are not very compatible, so I haven't done a huge amount in recent years, but hope to get back to it. So tonight I'm going to talk about just essentially, I don't want to assume that everybody understands how sports psychology works, and how I apply my wares in the high performance system. So I'll give a little background to that. I'll explain, I suppose, how the high performance system works overall with the number of moving parts in it and where psychology fits in. And then I look at some simple high performance strategies that I've observed over the years I've spent working in Irish sailing, that are easy to apply for the club racer or recreational racer, as well as the more competitive racer aspiring to international competition. So I've divided it up to things you can do before you race or before your event starts. Things, simple execution points around racing that I've seen that can make a big difference. And then how to manage the post-regatta or post-race period to maximize the opportunity of performing well in the next race. So Hollywood or media would have you believe that sports psychology involves just giving rousing speeches in the dressing room at halftime, or before a sailor goes on the water, that I'm giving them a motivational talk. But the reality is very far from that. I don't think, in fact, I've ever given any type of motivational or rousing speech. More often than not, I'm trying to distract people before they sail and help them think less about sailing. And also, rather than getting them hyped up and giving them rousing speeches, it tends to be trying to relax them. Most people don't need any help getting the nerves going, and before they compete. More often than not, people need to calm down. So what I thought I would be doing when I qualified as a sports psychologist almost 20 years ago was that I would just deliver kind of workshops or lectures or seminars to athletes around how to manage their mental skills in competition. And I also, I suppose our masters prepared us a lot for doing one-to-one meetings with athletes and coaches and discussing their performance, discussing areas that they needed to get better in, and implementing some strategies. So the education I got as a sports psychologist kind of prepared me for those two things. And I remember, like I said, sailing was one of the first opportunities I got straight out of my master's. I went down to work with a national Optimist squad, so probably a group of 12 to 14-year-olds. And I gave them a talk, which lasted an hour and a half, I think. And I pretty much covered my whole master's curriculum in that hour and a half, which, as you can imagine, wasn't a very successful approach with 12 to 14-year-old kids. So I have refined that skill over the years. And delivering workshops and having one-to-one meetings are very much a part of what I do. But the system around elite athletes is a lot more complex than just considerations about the athlete and coach. So just to give you an indication, in any of our aspiring Olympic athletes, they'll often have a service team or a backroom team of this size around them. And these are all the services we offer at the Institute of Sport. So we'll have the athletes, governing body staff, their coach, their performance director. But then in the Institute, we have teams of strength and conditioning, physios, doctors, nutritionists, physiologists, lifestyle advisors, analysts, performance psychologists, and mental health specialists, clinical psychologists. And then there are other people who have a say or an interest in the athlete's performance, like the people in their lives, family, friends, partners, training partners, agents, sponsors, employers, universities. So it's a complex network of people and a complex web of interaction, and reaching consensus and finding a path forward for the athlete isn't often the simplest thing with that many stakeholders with different viewpoints. But one thing I've learned along the way is it doesn't matter how much expertise you have and how much knowledge you possess when you work with an athlete and you become embedded in their sport. Athletes don't care what you know until they know that you care. And ultimately, I suppose the bedrock of sports psychology and my work with different athletes across different sports is spending time with them, getting to know them, getting to know the people important to them, and getting to know members of their backroom team. It's contingent on relationships and building trust. And when you have that trust, then you can start applying your knowledge and delivering your expertise. But it's probably something I didn't have a huge appreciation for when I started out. So how do all of those stakeholders interact with each other? Well, essentially, this is probably what our whole system is based around. So we start at the top, and in Olympic sports, our performance goal is generally defined around Olympic qualification, Olympic finals, Olympic medals. That's usually the driver of our objectives in our performance planning. And then we make long-term plans over 4 years, and we divide them into yearly plans, and then monthly, weekly, even daily plans. But our overarching plans tend to be 4-year plans. And within that, we look at where the athlete is now, where they need to get to, and where their greatest areas of improvement. And each of the experts in their field, whether it's strength and conditioning, nutrition, psychology, input into that plan on where they believe the athlete can make gains and where they can be supported. The athlete then trains, and they're monitored by all the coach and the experts, the sports science and medicine experts. Any modifications to the plan required are hopefully spotted early. And we continue to monitor and support the athlete while they prepare to compete. They compete, they get an outcome, and from that outcome, we always review. It's really important that for every major event, we conduct a performance review, and again, that we involve as many of the stakeholders as possible to try and learn some very clear action points, so we don't get caught in the cycle of making the same mistake over and over and over again. And one thing I will say for Irish sailing is it's a sport that invests heavily in terms of time and effort into review practices compared to other sports I've worked in. So one of the important things in, I suppose, because I work across a range of sports, and a lot of our psychology practitioners do, is that we understand the psychological demands of each of the sports we work in. And the demands of sailing are quite unique and quite different to those of other sports and sports that are probably more mainstream, like athletics or swimming, where the psychological challenges are relatively easy to see as a spectator. But for sailing, they're not so much. We don't get up close with the athletes as they're racing. A lot of our knowledge of what happened to them is based on their reflection. So there are a lot of challenges in working in sailing, but there are very specific challenges in being a sailor. And most of these, I'm sure you'll be familiar with yourselves. Sailing goes on for a long time and often in quite miserable conditions. So keeping concentration when you're cold and tired is really challenging. Because sailing is full of so many variables, environmental conditions, wind, water, accepting that things are changeable, that there are a lot of things you can't control, and managing emotions when things go wrong are really critical to success. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go on, and something I've observed in the high performance program, and something I've worked on with the athletes. In crewed boats, communicating well under pressure is really critical. And as with any team sport, what tends to happen when people are stressed is they either over communicate or under communicate, but the quality of the communication tends to disintegrate as the pressure ramps up. Like we mentioned with sailing, because it takes place in so many different environments, from lakes to seas to wavy conditions to flat water, the ability to be able to adapt and change between venues, but also between different wind conditions and strengths, is a challenge that indoor sports, for example, don't face, where the conditions under which they perform are relatively similar from one competition to the next. And building that consistency across all conditions is challenging. And I guess it's particularly challenging for Irish sailors, where we tend to have to, if we're training at home, tend to train a lot in windy conditions because it's what we're most used to. And we often struggle when we go abroad and compete in lighter conditions in the middle of summer. So building that consistency and preparing for all conditions can be quite a challenge as an Irish sailor. And then, because sailing events go on for so long, staying focused and motivated over a long regatta is, again, particularly difficult, especially when the regatta gets off to a bad start. So they're all challenges that I think I should resonate with most of you, and are things that I've worked on with the sailors through the years. And here are some of the strategies I've identified that can help to offset some of those challenges. So the first thing is around setting clear objectives for your performance before each regatta or before each event. And very often when I ask athletes or sailors, what are you hoping to achieve? They go straight to outcome goals. So they focus on, like, oh, I'd love to finish in the top 10, or I'd love to make the gold fleet, or I'd love to win a race. And while it's motivating to have objectives like that, they're not necessarily controllable, because winning a race depends on the performance of other boats. Coming in the top 10 overall depends on who's entered the regatta. So they're useful from a motivational sense. They tell you where you want to go, but they don't necessarily tell you how to get there. So that's something really important to bear in mind when you're setting your objectives for a season or for a particular regatta, is not just focusing on outcome goals, but thinking more around your performance in detail. So what are the areas of your performance that are more controllable to you and more measurable? For example, something I worked on recently with the sailor was they were rounding the top mark in very good positions, but losing places downwind relatively consistently. So that performance objective for that sailor was to at least go from not losing places to maintaining position, but ultimately with the objective of starting to gain positions downwind. And when we looked at this in more detail, it seemed that the sailor didn't lack speed in training. Their downwind technique was relatively good. The coach was happy enough with the technicals. So we looked at, well, what are the things that the athlete can do to achieve this or improve this element of their performance? So one of the things we looked at was, well, if you're quick downwind in training, but not so much in racing, what are the behaviors that change between the racing and training context? So one of the things we identified was in racing, the sailor had been so focused on the upwind, on their speed and their strategy, and had done so very effectively because they were approaching the windward mark generally in very favourable positions. They hadn't thought ahead to the next leg. So they were basically making up their downwind strategy as they were rounding the top mark, because they'd just been so focused on their upwind performance. So one of the things we identified was, okay, well, let's not worry too much about your downwind technique, but let's think about how you plan your downwind strategy. So we said, okay, from about 5 boat lengths out, you need to shift your attention from being fully focused on the upwind to now thinking what's next, what comes after the mark. So a very simple checklist almost was looking at wind or pressure down the course, remembering were there any tidal factors. Then consciously relaxing, because that approach to the windward mark is quite a stressful situation, especially with close boat to boat incidents. So try not to get too activated or hyped up around that mark, because it will slow you down when you go turn to go downwind. Release the controls as you're rounding, and then immediately hit the angle. So your sole focus as you rounded the mark is to pick your angle and go for it, and delay looking back, delay worrying about other people, just get into a rhythm quickly. And then once you're in your rhythm and you've got your top speed, then you pay more attention to the other boats around you. So what we figured out was this sailor was too fixated on getting on the other boats and losing that opportunity to get away from the windward mark quickly and catch those first 1 or 2 waves. So it was simply a matter of setting those objectives for the racing. And while that sounds like maybe a complex routine, really it probably takes about 5 seconds to think with pressure, tide, controls, relax and go. And it worked really, really effectively. It was the sailor went from being, kind of dreading downwind to being pretty consistent, and certainly not leaking places downwind, and maintaining their position throughout the race. So simple questions you can ask yourself going into this season is, what's your main outcome goal for the season? Secondly, what elements of your performance do you need to improve in order to achieve this outcome? So not just hoping you make the top 10 by luck, but actually thinking about where are the deficits in your performance, where are the areas that are pretty good that you're happy with. So maybe if it's starting, what processes do you need to implement in order to get those better starts or be more consistently getting off the line in the first row in clear air? So it may be you need to just practice maneuvers. Your boat handling isn't good enough. Maybe you need to practice more variety of starts. So not always go for the pin or not always go for the middle, but in training races, practice discomfort, practice starts that you're not that comfortable in, because there'll be certain regattas where you're forced to start at the committee boat end. And if you've never practiced it in less pressurized races, there's no way you're going to be comfortable executing it in the big moments. So forcing yourself to do things or practice processes in training races, rather than constantly trying to win training races by doing what comes naturally to you or what's comfortable. The second thing around pre-race planning is checklists. And this is not exciting or earth-shattering, but there are certain things that you need to do if you want to be a consistent performer. The first one is constantly doing equipment checks. One of the things you hear a lot from sailors is, oh, I was really unlucky, my main halyard broke, when I was rounding the bottom mark. It's rarely bad luck when things like that happen. Obviously, you can have faulty equipment that's new, but generally, if equipment breaks because you haven't replaced it early enough, that's bad planning. It's not bad luck. And that's something that elite athletes across all sports need to be really, really diligent on. But it doesn't require any particular talent or expertise. It just requires time, having a checklist, doing a stock take on your spares, and making sure you have everything you need. Before you go on the water, I've seen this a lot with sailors, is coming out with inadequate supplies for the conditions. And I remember sailing myself. I pretty much packed the same lunch irrespective of whether it was blowing 25 knots or 5 knots, or whether it was 15 degrees or 25 degrees. And obviously those things affect, if it's 25 degrees and it's windy, you're going to sweat, you're going to be tired, you need more liquid and you need more fuel. So adjusting your food intake and your water intake based on your output. It's not something that I did well when I sail myself. Likewise, mistakes I've seen sailors make, having the wrong clothing for the weather. If you're freezing, if you don't, or if you're too hot, it's really, really hard to concentrate. It becomes a distraction, and something that I struggle with myself. Seasickness. I've seen a lot of sailors' regattas go by the wayside because they got seasick. They didn't have any medication with them, and there was really, it was impossible for them to perform. They just wanted to be on shore and away from the racing situation. And it was the undoing of their regatta one day of feeling sick like that. So if the conditions look like they're going to be a risk in terms of seasickness, make sure you have medication and make sure you pack the right clothing for the conditions you expect. Excuse me. Another thing that is very easy to do is to accumulate a database of information on specific venues. So, excuse me for a second.
Just while Kate is settling there, I'll tell you a good example of an outcome goal which she and I had together as we did some team racing into varsities years ago, where our outcome goal was to beat her brother's team. So any motivation that you can get, I think, is worth it to try and get the focus on.
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. Is that a
Sorry
good
about that.
example of an? Is it a good example of an outcome goal, Kate?
It was.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we accomplished it in the end, did we?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Sorry about that. I'm just recovering from a cold. So having a database of information on specific venues is very simple to put together after a regatta and can be invaluable when you're going back to that event. Building that database of meteorological and environmental information was definitely one of the things that gave Annalise an edge in the London and Rio Olympics. So in London, it was almost like a home Olympics, sailing in Weymouth consistently for 3 years at least before the games. And in Rio, Annalise was probably the sailor who had spent most time in Brazil before the games. Spent months on end living there, training, knew the race courses inside out, knew the specific tidal factors, knew the environmental factors, and it was a massive competitive advantage. So anytime you gather that information, just jot it down somewhere. It doesn't require any particular skill, or it doesn't cost anything, but retain the acquired knowledge. If you don't write it down, it's lost, or you're relying on memory, which is very faulty at the best of times. The weather forecast is obviously, in terms of pre-event planning, important, but again, it's something I've put an asterisk there for a reason, because sometimes sailors get so caught up in the weather forecast, they actually allow that to dictate their tactical decisions rather than what they see in front of them. So again, when I've been working with sailors in the past, we very much filtered the information that's important rather than overloading them with too much detail, which kind of makes their decision making more complex. So weather forecast is important, but don't let it override what you see in front of you when you're racing. Another aspect of pre-race planning to consider is if you're in a boat, if you're not in the single-hander, is your crew work or your interpersonal dynamics. So there's a few things to consider here. Again, this doesn't require any specific expertise, but just in the same way you would in a work environment, is giving each member of the team specific roles and responsibilities. Having a meeting on shore to go, well, who's responsible for reading sailing instructions? Who's responsible for knowing the course? Who's responsible for knowing any specific requirements about, having GPS or tagging in or out? Who's responsible for logistics? Who's responsible for equipment and spares? And it's a very simple thing to do. Clarifies confusion, reduces the likelihood of making simple errors like sailing the wrong course or getting disqualified for on a technicality. So and likewise then within the racing itself, being really clear on whose responsibility it is for different things. Who's looking after the watch for the countdown, who's calling for other boats, who's responsible for looking for any course changes. If it's everyone's responsibility, it often ends up being no one's responsibility. So having real clarity on what those jobs are in the boat and who's responsible for each one. Second piece is around communication. So this is like I mentioned, with any team sport, communication is really important. Making sure everyone's on the same page. So having clarity on what your outcome goals is important, but more so having clarity on those performance and process goals that I mentioned. What are we trying to execute today? What are the things that are going to give us the best chance of getting the outcome we want? What are the expectations in terms of feeding in information like pressure? It's seeing things happening up the course. Who's responsible? What does the helmsman want? Whose voice do they want to hear? Again, I mentioned under communicating is just as problematic as over communicating. So understanding what's a help and what's a hindrance. And then likewise, aside from communicating tactical information, how do you communicate to each other? So again, this is something that probably doesn't happen that much in sailing. It happens quite a bit in team sports that I've worked in hockey or Gaelic. How do you support each other? So some people, when things are going badly, they want to kick up the arse, to put it crudely. Other people want an arm around the shoulder and to be told, it's cool, you've got this, you're great, don't worry about it. So have that conversation. What works for you? What helps you when things aren't going well? What kind of takes you out of your own head when you're struggling a bit? And what signs should your crewmate look for that you are struggling? Are you starting to give out a lot, or are you going really quiet? Are you just making knee-jerk reactions without thinking things through? So how do you identify what's your telltale sign that you're maybe losing your composure a little? And what do you want from your teammates to help you regain your composure? And especially in a boat of two, it's really important that you understand each other that well. And then it would be lovely if no conflict ever arose, but the reality is, in competitive pressurized situation, when tempers flare, conflict is a natural part of sport. And actually, if you have no conflict at all in your team, chances are you're probably a little stale and settling a bit. So healthy conflict can be a good thing as long as there's a clear way of resolving it and it doesn't spill over and kind of continue on. So if there is conflict within a race, how do you resolve it? Do you and have that agreed in advance? There's an onus on the person communicating not to exaggerate or exacerbate the conflict, but there's also an onus on the person receiving the communication not to elevate it either, to just bite your tongue and let it go and maybe address it afterwards. But so that's one of the things we would often say is, okay, really the person communicating shouldn't say things that are likely to cause conflict, but the person receiving the communication shouldn't throw petrol on the fire. Both parties have a responsibility to keep things under wraps and to keep focused on the performance and deal with conflict at a more appropriate time. Okay, so they're kind of the pre-race things that you can think about. Now we move on to the race. So again, look, I don't have any magic wand or silver bullet to tell you how to win races, but here are the things I've observed that are maybe relatively easy gains and are pretty simple to implement for all racers. The first thing is having a consistent pre-start routine, and this is something actually most sailors are reasonably good at, is knowing what you need to do before the start. But work back, figure out all of the jobs you need to do, checking the tide, checking the bias, taking wind readings, maybe doing a couple of hoists and drops, practicing your downwind feel. What time is that going to take? When you add all those together, how long are those elements going to take? And that's how long you need for your pre-start routine. Again, it's helpful to write it down. When I'm working with especially the youth sailors, I have them write it down and figure out, well, this is how long before the race you really need to kind of engage your brain and start concentrating, because often I'll find they'll go out on the water, they'll launch in loads of time, they launch an hour before, but 10 minutes before the start, they'll still be chatting to their mate and they'll have forgotten to do a significant portion of their pre-race prep. So knowing exactly what time you need to engage in that pre-start routine is really important. The second thing that's really important in sailing is having a plan. And sometimes that plan won't be right. Often it won't be right on some days. But having the wrong plan or having a plan that hasn't worked is better than having no plan. If you have a plan that didn't work, at least you can adjust the plan for the next upwind or for the next race. If you had no plan at all and you were just sailing sort of reactively and just tacking whenever, or just trying to follow other people without really knowing why you're going in a particular direction, you have no way of assessing your performance after the race. So it's very hard to take corrective action if it didn't go well. And I'm guessing if you didn't have a plan, it probably didn't go well. So a really simple rule is a wrong plan is better than no plan at all. So make sure you have at least a general idea of where you're going to start, where you're going to go on the upwind, and how you view the first downwind leg. And look, if it doesn't work, it won't work all the time. Nothing works all the time, but having a plan is really important for giving yourself a feeling of control and being able to assess your performance relatively objectively and take action in response. Another thing around execution is don't get blinded by outcome. So a lot of sailors, they'll especially again the academy or the youth sailors, they'll be sailing along in an international regatta and coming in the 30s and spending half the downwind counting the number of boats in front of them instead of focusing on how to make the boat go faster and pick off other boats one by one. So not getting blinded by outcome or results and just remembering what you committed to executing. What were the process goals you thought would be important to give you the best chance of performing before you came on the water? Well, they're the things you should be focusing on when you're on the water. And probably no more than 2 to 3 in any race. You're not going to be able to remember, 5 or 10. Just a couple of really clear points that help you refocus and or narrow your focus on what's important on each given day. One of the things I've observed over the years is conflict with other boats is a part of sailing. It's the nature of sailing is having interactions and rule infractions. If you're in a boat, a crewed boat, the helm, although they'll be involved in the initial infraction, needs to stay out of the afters. Give one, again, this goes back to the roles and responsibilities, give one member of the crew responsibility for dealing with that, whether it's calling protest or calling someone to do their turns. The helm needs to just refocus on making the boat go fast. I've seen plenty of times where the helm is looking backwards and shouting and roaring at the opposition, and they're 10 degrees off the wind, heading towards the windward mark and losing places by the new time. So it's really important that the person whose job it is to make the boat go fast continues to make it go fast in the right direction and doesn't allow that infraction to distract them for the next couple of minutes. And then the last one, which is probably the one I spend most time working with the Olympic sailors and the high performance guys on, is managing errors or managing mistakes. So to go back to the earlier point, nothing will work all the time. You will get your plan wrong, you will make bad tactical decisions, and you will lose places. But the damage of those errors is minimized if you manage your emotional response. So often what I see happening is a sailor makes a mistake and they lose 5 places on one tack. They cross back and they realize they've lost a couple of places. They get really annoyed with themselves, they get really frustrated, and then their next tactical decision is based on trying to win back all those 5 places in one go. So they'll do something quite high risk, or they'll separate from the fleet to try and find a quick fix solution to an error, rather than just accepting that the error has happened, refocusing, remembering their plan, and picking off the places one by one. So that desire to make back all of those places in one go by banging a corner or doing something outlandish is an emotionally driven decision. It's rarely the risk reward of that decision following an error needs to be carefully assessed. So it's something, generally that first error isn't catastrophic. If you lose 5 places, it's not the end of the race for you. But the second mistake you make after that, the emotional based decision, is usually one that ends up being really costly. So it's a skill to develop, but there's no easy thing I can give you to resolve it. But the awareness that as humans, we have a tendency to do it. The other sport where this is really obvious is golf. If there are any golfers in the audience, a lot of golfers will hit a bad shot, end up in the trees, and then rather than just trying to chip out a simple shot, they'll try and take on this really difficult shot to hit in between 2 trees at a time when they're least likely to execute it, because they're frustrated and they've just already hit a bad shot. It's similar in sailing. You've made a bad decision. Don't try and double down on it by making an extra bad decision. So accept your losses and be patient in making those places back, rather than hoping for a miracle. So after the racing, whether it's a one race day or as is mostly the case in dinghy racing in particular, what do you do after the first race of the day? Well, the first thing is, again, not earth shattering. Make sure you eat something, make sure you drink. If you have to concentrate for 3 or 4 hours in a day, you're never going to survive just on a couple of sips of water and your breakfast. So fuel well, move around if it's especially light weather and you've been kind of in an uncomfortable position, stretch, move, relax, have a chat if you need, and make sure you stay warm. It's hard to concentrate when you're cold. The second thing you need to do is have a reflection. So once you've kind of recovered from the race, think about, what did you learn? Did you stick to your plan? If not, why not? Did you execute your processes, or did you even think of them at all? What did you learn from the first race that's important for the next race? So just some really simple reflective questions. And rather than, as often happens, we spend that time giving out about the race officer or other opponents, which we can't do anything about, what's important for the next race that you can control? And then the last piece is, I've seen this time and time again where sailors put loads of effort into preparing for the first race of the day. They'll do a 30 to 40 minute pre-race routine. And then before the second race of the day, they'll start thinking about their strategy when the gun goes, when the preparatory signal goes. So you need to think about switching on and giving yourself enough time to do all of the things you did, maybe in a more sped up way, but you need to check the wind again, you need to check the tide again, you need to check the line bias. Give yourself time to do all those. Don't spend all of the time between races chatting and switching off completely, because the longer you're switched off, the longer it takes to switch on. And then finally, at the end of a regatta, what are the important things? Well, the first thing is, sorry, this is even in between days during a regatta, is don't obsess over the scoreboard. A lot of sailors spend a lot of time thinking about permutations, and if they beat X by 5 points and Y beats them by 8 points, then they have a chance of coming in the top three. It's mostly energy that's misspent. You can't do too much about where other people are coming or how they're doing. Maybe before the last race of an event, there are some considerations around having to cover specific boats, but after day one, day two, generally looking at points differences is just a waste of time. So don't obsess over the scoreboard. It was something Annalise did a lot of early in her career and didn't look at it once during the Olympics in Rio. She often never knew where she was coming overall until the medal race, when she was aware of the permutations and who she needed to watch out for. And then the other post-race element that's really important, or post-regatta, is doing a more comprehensive review. So looking at, well, the 4 elements of performance: physical, technical, tactical, and psychological, and assessing where you are in those. So a lot of times, if events hasn't gone well for you, the easiest thing and the quickest thing to do is throw money at the problem. So just buy new sails or buy new equipment. The solution isn't in the equipment, it's in you. So think about your performance in an objective way. It's useful to do this often with an independent, I'm not going to say mediator, but an independent observer to ask the questions. But reviewing is a really, really important part of the high performance process. So some really simple take home points from those pre, during, and post event tips. The first one is planning goes a long way. It doesn't cost any money. It minimizes chaos. It reduces anxiety, and it facilitates consistency. So put time and effort into planning. It pays dividends in the long run. I like this quote from Bobby Knight, who's a US basketball coach. Everyone has the will to win. It's only those with the discipline to prepare that actually win. And then the second one I'd like you to really remember is review like a high performer and you'll reap the rewards. So this image here is of Annalise doing a review after she finished 4th in London. And I think when we added up the different formats of reviews she'd spent 15 hours in total reviewing with the whole team, with herself and Rory, her coach, with me and her, and with an independent facilitator. And she learned some really simple actions. We were able to distill her performance down to 3 really key things: communicating with her team under pressure, being a bit more combative on the race course, excuse me, and committing to being aggressive in situations of pressure. And this post-it was one of the conclusions she came to after London. Was one of the questions was, if you had the chance to compete in that medal race again, what would you do, or how would you approach it? And she said, I would not to fear losing, but see the opportunity to fight to win. And 4 years later in Rio, going into the medal race, she found herself in exactly the same situation, with a chance of a medal, but also with the chance of finishing 4th. And Rory, her coach, had saved this learning and brought it out the night before the medal race and said, okay, here's what you said you do if you had a chance to do it again. Tomorrow's your chance. See the opportunity to fight to win. And it was really, really effective, being able to refer back to her own learnings, to her own words. And she said that medal race in a much more aggressive and fearless way than she had in London. So that's it from me in terms of slides. The picture I had up there at the end was just, I'm often asked by people for suggestions of sports psychology for sailing. There's very limited materials out there. Maybe I'll get around to writing a book myself one day, but this is one sailing specific book that is very simple. There's a lot of practical suggestions and exercises in it. So it's one that's worth looking at if you're interested in learning more about this area.
Kate, thanks a million. That felt like 10 minutes. It just was so interesting. The time, like, it was really, really interesting, and good to understand the HP side of things and how we can apply them ourselves. I think we, there's even further you could go when you delve into it, I'm sure. So we'll open the floor up. If people can see the chat function, to use that to write a question. I think Jim has a great point that you should write a book, Kate. I think we'll all be behind you. You'll have 100 Amazon subscribers buying it as Christmas gifts. But no, it was really interesting. So if people want to either use the chat or pop their hand up via Teams, or just switch on your camera and your unmute yourself, please do, because I think we all can learn a lot.
Katie, I had 2 questions that came into me.
Oh yeah, great. Yeah.
I'll call them out to you. They said, how would you change from your talk to your OPIs if you were to do it again?
I would do as I just did there and distill it down to 1 or 2 take-home points. Cover one topic with an age group that young. Probably keep it to 20 to 30 minutes with 1 or 2 take-home points.
Okay. And the second question, they said, when things go wrong, what do you say? When things are going wrong for your athlete?
The first thing is time your intervention. So often you say nothing until the athlete is ready to talk. I think one of the times I knew that I had built a relationship of trust with Annalise was when I went up to her after a day she'd been black flagged when she was leading a regatta, and she told me to F off. And I knew that she knew me well enough to say that to me instead of being polite and engaging in social niceties. And it wasn't personal. Like, she came back and said, oh, sorry, I just wasn't ready to talk. But that's one of the things, is just biding your time until the emotion has subsided a bit and people can think more clearly. One of the things that I'm always careful of is, and I'm a parent now, and it's often very tempting to abdicate responsibility. So say you were really unlucky, or like the race officer, it was their fault or someone else's fault. It's to try and see where they have a role in the outcomes or control over their performances. If you allow people to abdicate responsibility for poor outcomes all the time, there's no learning in it. So sometimes you have to ask hard questions, but then sometimes people are genuinely unlucky. So I guess there isn't a one specific thing you can say, but one is I would say is managing your timing of your intervention, and the second one I would say is to get people to take responsibility and in what they attribute outcomes to.
Brilliant. I have 3 small boys, Kate, and they are forever saying, oh, Adam did that, or Ben was the one that, and I think that's a really good life lesson as well. Just what part did you play in that, and how could you have made the outcome a little bit better for yourself? So that's a really good point. Brian has said, do you have any recommendations or a template of what questions an independent mediator should ask when reviewing a day's racing or an event?
So what I would do on after a day's racing, if there was racing the subsequent day, would be fairly light touch. So like what the stop start continue is often a nice simple review template. So what were we doing today that we need to stop? What did we do but need to do better is the continue, and start is what didn't we do that we need to do tomorrow. So that stop start continue is a nice, really simple template. The broader questions then, I suppose a post-event review is that template I put up of physical, technical, tactical, mental. That's a good template to review. And again, you can say, like, what are our strengths and weaknesses in each of those quadrants? that's often a good way of guiding, areas of deficit, or also being aware of where your strengths are, or what differentiates you from your competitors.
I suppose it eliminates the things that aren't important to your review as well. You know, if you've got brand new kit and the kit didn't cause the problem, you can say, okay, that wasn't the issue, and you can concentrate on the other areas for that review as well, can't you? So Jim wants to know, how do you let an angry or loud crew member know to ease off the jets?
So in general, the easiest way to do this is to have an agreement in advance of what you will say to them at times where their anger is disruptive. So again, I was mentioning in team sports, this is very common, where someone is giving off at the ref, or they're getting carded all the time, or they're communicating negatively with their teammates. It's something to discuss away from the boat, and have an agreed, like, so take a minute, for example, is one of the ones I've had with team sport athletes. If they're starting to get really angry and negative, is have their teammate or their coach say, take a minute, and it just reminds them to stop talking. And usually when people take a minute, it also involves taking a breath or stepping back, and that helps. But in the moment, telling someone to calm down when they're really angry is probably going to make them more angry. So Jim, if it's someone who's consistent form in that way of getting angry, it's probably something to address away from the race course, and then implement on the race course whatever strategy you agree on.
Yep, that's fair. Karen wants to know, when your initial plan goes wrong, how do you come up with a new plan very quickly, and what do you do if your crew or helm disagrees?
Yeah, it's pretty difficult. I think you have, like, there has to be an agreement on who has the ultimate decision making power, because it's not always a consensus can't be reached in a short amount of time. So the first thing is, are you the primary decision maker? Because that's important to know. So if the helm or crew disagrees and you're the primary decision maker, you still go with your plan. How do you come up with a new plan quickly? Well, I guess if the old plan goes wrong, know why it went wrong. So a lot of the time, we don't know. You don't know if they got better wind on the other side, or they got a lift just coming into the mark. But if it went wrong, why did it go wrong? And does it mean you do the direct opposite the next time? So if your plan was to go left and right came in good, is it because there's more wind consistently on the right, or was it because you got a bad lane coming in and you went slower than everyone? So I think that's the first thing, is understanding why the initial plan went wrong, and does that reason then cause you to throw the whole plan out, or just execute it better?
Okay, and I think, you know, what you were saying on one of your last slides, that you examined the 4 areas as well, and if you get into a routine of examining those each time after each race, then you very quickly can isolate what one problem might be causing, or multiple problems, and address those quickly in order to get to the next. But if you're not into the routine of examining those four areas, then it becomes more difficult, because you're all over the place, whereas you've kind of got a plan as to how to review yourself. And there's, what is your telltale sign that you're losing your composure?
Oh,
Maybe we should ask Katie this, should we?
No. When her brother's beating her.
Yeah, I was awful to my crews. I'll hold my hand up and say I gave them an awful time when I was sailing mirrors. I'm much more mellow these days.
Okay, fair enough. That's all the questions that we have for the moment, and we've only got about 3 minutes left. So if there's anybody else has a question before we finish up, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
What I might do, just while people are, maybe if there's any other questions to pop in, is just to let everyone know that after the webinar this evening, we'll share with you a very small, like 1 minute long questionnaire. And really it's just to look for feedback on, not only on today, but on the webinar kind of and workshops in general. And if there's any other areas specifically that you think are worth covering on, be it, you know, some double-handed sailing, or big event preparation, or any ideas, as a group, we're looking for ideas, and we can set up more webinars like this, because I think it's a great way to share learnings. But I'll just take that time there to mention that. So
Great. I think that's all of them. And people can email me if you have other questions that you think of afterwards, and I can send them on to Kate as well.
And also just a reminder that this will be saved up on sailing.ie, and Kate, you might share with us as well your deck, and we can circulate it to the people who've attended this evening. So that would be great. So thanks very much, everybody. Enjoy your Monday evening and enjoy your sailing season ahead. And thanks, Kate.
Thanks, everyone.